Have you ever experienced that moment when someone looks right through you, judging your worth based on your appearance rather than your abilities? If you felt the sting of being underestimated or overlooked because of who you are, this story will resonate in the deepest corners of your heart. Before we begin this journey of hidden truths, buried prejudice, and unexpected redemption, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing these powerful narratives to light, stories that might otherwise remain untold. If you've ever discovered that an object from your past carried more meaning than you initially realized, share your experience in the comments below. Sometimes the smallest things hold the greatest truths. On a scorching summer afternoon, when the air shimmered with heat above the cracked asphalt, Maya Olivera's life collided with her past in the most unexpected way. A chance encounter on a deserted stretch of highway would unravel decades of secrets, expose the systemic racism woven into corporate America's fabric, and reunite a family torn apart by greed and prejudice. The sapphire ring on her finger, a family heirloom she'd protected for 20 years, would become the key that unlocked a truth powerful enough to topple an empire built on discrimination and deceit. Maya had grown accustomed to the weight of others' assumptions. At 34, she'd built Hope Mechanical into the most respected auto repair shop in Aurora County, despite the obstacles that came with being both black and female in an industry dominated by white men. Her hands, small but strong, could diagnose an engine's ailments through touch alone, a skill honed through years of determination and an unwavering refusal to be defined by others' limited expectations. The morning had begun like any other, the familiar scent of motor oil and metal shavings hanging in the air of her workshop, as Maya finished an early repair before heading out to pick up parts from a supplier in the neighboring county. The radio hummed softly in the background, the local news announcer's voice rising with excitement as he described Weber Enterprises' upcoming groundbreaking ceremony for their new corporate headquarters. The massive complex would revitalize the region, bringing jobs and prosperity to an area that had struggled economically for decades. Maya turned the radio off with a sharp twist of her wrist, her jaw tightening at the familiar narrative. The announcer had conveniently omitted how Weber Enterprises had acquired the land for their corporate paradise through what locals euphemistically called strategic real estate consolidation. In reality, it was the culmination of decades of predatory practices targeting vulnerable property owners, particularly minority families with limited resources to fight back against the corporate behemoth. The summer heat pressed down on Maya's shoulders as she drove her aging pickup truck along Route 16, the open windows offering little relief from the oppressive temperature. Her thoughts drifted to the monthly bills waiting on her desk. The loan payment for the new diagnostic equipment, the increased rent on the workshop space, the medical expenses for her uncle Xavier's ongoing treatment. Success hadn't come easily, and maintaining it required constant vigilance against the forces that seemed perpetually aligned against small business owners like herself, especially those who didn't fit the expected profile. The sight of a stranded vehicle on the roadside pulled Maya from her thoughts. A sleek Maserati, midnight blue and gleaming despite the thin layer of dust from the road, sat with its hood raised while steam billowed ominously from the engine compartment. Beside it stood a man in an expensive charcoal suit, his tie loosened at the neck, frustration evident in every line of his body as he stared helplessly at his phone. Maya hesitated, her finger hovering over the turn signal. Experience had taught her what to expect: the surprised look, the immediate distrust, the condescending tone once they realized the mechanic was both black and female. Luxury car owners were often the worst, their entitlement extending to assumptions about who should service their expensive machines. Yet something compelled her to pull over, perhaps the professional obligation she'd always honored, regardless of how she might be treated in return. The asphalt radiated heat as Maya approached, toolbox in hand. The man looked up, irritation flashing across his features before settling into a mask of carefully controlled impatience. Maya recognized him instantly. Thomas Weber, heir to the Weber Enterprises fortune and newly appointed CEO. His face appeared regularly in the business section of the newspaper she studied religiously, tracking the company's expansion and the communities affected in its wake. "Need some help?" Maya called, maintaining a professional distance. Thomas Weber turned, not bothering to hide his skepticism, as his eyes performed the familiar assessment, taking in her work clothes, her gender, her race, before dismissing her capability in a single glance. "I have a crucial meeting in 15 minutes, he replied, checking his platinum watch with pointed emphasis. "My assistant should be sending proper help. There's no decent signal in this damn place." The familiar sting of being presumed incompetent washed over Maya, but she'd long ago learned to channel that feeling into fuel for proving people wrong. Without asking permission, she moved past him and leaned over the smoking engine. The smell of burnt coolant and overheated metal filled her nostrils as her experienced eyes identified the problem immediately. "It's the cooling system," she diagnosed with practiced confidence. "I can fix it temporarily so you can make it to the city. It won't last long, but it'll give you a few hours." "Are you sure?" Thomas asked, making no effort to hide his doubt, his eyes narrowing as he watched her hands hovering over his expensive machine. "I'm a mechanic," she replied evenly, holding his gaze. "I have a shop 10 miles from here." His expression said everything his politeness prevented him from voicing, disbelief that someone like her could possibly understand the intricacies of his luxury vehicle. It was a look Maya had grown accustomed to, the subtle racism that questioned her competence before she'd even begun. Without waiting for his approval, she returned to her truck for her toolbox, its weight familiar and reassuring in her hand. Her movements were precise, economical, without a single unnecessary gesture, as she began working on the engine with absolute concentration. Her hands, small but strong, moved with surgical precision around the hot metal, adjusting and reconnecting with a confidence born of profound knowledge. "5 more minutes, and you would have blown the engine completely," she commented, without looking up, tightening a connection with practiced ease. "These models are powerful, but surprisingly delicate, like some people." The indirect remark didn't go unnoticed, but Thomas was too concerned about his meeting to feel offended. He watched with growing surprise as she manipulated various parts with obvious expertise, his prejudice gradually giving way to grudging respect. "How do you know so much about luxury cars working in?" Thomas stopped abruptly, awareness of the bias in his unfinished question finally registering. "In a forgotten village?" Maya finished, giving him a direct look over her shoulder. "I read, I study, I care about my work. Excellence isn't exclusive to big cities or certain demographics, Mr. Weber." Thomas was startled to hear his surname. "How do you know who I am?" "Your picture is often in the business section of the newspaper," she replied simply, closing the hood with a decisive movement. "There. That should get you into town." "I owe you one," Thomas said, visibly relieved as the immediate crisis passed. He pulled several $100 bills from his leather wallet. "Please accept this as my thanks." It was when she extended her hand to receive the payment that Thomas saw it, an antique silver ring with a small blue sapphire, surprisingly delicate for someone with such hard-working hands, a ring he knew intimately. The world seemed to freeze in that instant. Recognition flashed across his face, followed by confusion and then disbelief. The color drained from his cheeks as he stared at the sapphire, gleaming against Maya's dark skin. "Where did you get that ring?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly shaky, stripped of its corporate confidence. Maya instinctively closed her fist, partially shielding the jewel. "It was my mother's," she replied cautiously. "Why do you ask?" What Maya couldn't know was that 20 years earlier, that same ring had been placed in her small child's hands by a boy who had promised to return for her. A boy who would become the man standing before her. A man who had broken a sacred promise and now found her again in the most unlikely circumstance. Thomas's phone rang insistently, breaking the tense moment. The screen displayed Elise with 6th call. Beneath it, the woman who would soon become his wife through a merger disguised as marriage. "Your meeting, Mr. Weber," Maya reminded him coldly, noting his troubled expression. "The investors are waiting." As Thomas drove away in his temporarily repaired Maserati, Maya stood motionless by her truck, the hot air shimmering around her. "He didn't recognize me," she murmured, stroking the ring with her thumb, an automatic gesture cultivated over 20 years. After all, he never really saw me. The encounter left Maya unsettled for the remainder of the day. As she worked on vehicles at Hope Mechanical, her mind kept returning to Thomas Weber's face when he'd noticed her ring. The shock, the recognition, something that looked almost like guilt. The radio played softly in the background, announcements about Weber Enterprises' upcoming groundbreaking ceremony, punctuating music and local news. The corporate complex would be built on land that once belonged to local families, many of them minorities, who had been systematically pushed out through what corporate attorneys called aggressive acquisition strategies, and what those affected called predatory exploitation. "You're going to destroy that carburetor," observed Xavier, her uncle, approaching cautiously. Tall and gray-haired at the temples, he moved with the slight limp that had worsened over recent years, a reminder of the industrial accident that had ended his own mechanical career and pushed Maya to develop her skills beyond what most considered possible for someone of her age and background. "He showed up, Uncle X," Maya said without preamble, knowing her uncle would understand immediately. "Thomas Weber, with a broken-down car. It's like some cruel twist of fate." Xavier froze, the shop rag in his hand momentarily forgotten. Thomas Weber? The boy who promised to return? "The man who forgot," Maya corrected, drying her hands on a rag. He looked at me and saw only an anonymous black mechanic. He recognized the ring, but not the girl who had kept it for 2 decades. That night, after the shop closed and Xavier had gone home, Maya opened a wooden box stored under her bed. Inside were newspaper clippings tracing Thomas Weber's rise to power, carefully preserved over the years, as if maintaining a connection to a past that had shaped her present in ways she was still coming to understand. His face appeared in articles about innovation, corporate philanthropy, and his recent engagement to Elise Harrington, heiress to a fashion industry fortune. What the articles neglected to mention was how Weber Enterprises had built its fortune by systematically acquiring properties from vulnerable minority families through predatory practices, offering pennies on the dollar, and leveraging the racial biases embedded in the banking and legal systems. The expansion that the business press celebrated as visionary had left a trail of displaced communities and broken promises in its wake. "Tomorrow, he won't even remember the ring," she murmured to the empty room, the sound of distant thunder echoing her turbulent thoughts. Maya was wrong. The next morning, as she opened the workshop, an inconspicuous sedan pulled into the gravel lot. Thomas emerged, this time without his expensive suit, dressed in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, as if trying to blend in with the world he had left behind decades ago. "We're not open," Maya said, maintaining her distance, awareness prickling along her spine at this unexpected development. "Actually, I came to return this," he replied, holding out his hand. In the center of his palm was a small carved wooden brooch, a bird with outstretched wings, Maya's Frolzker given to Thomas as a farewell gift at the orphanage. Maya's world stopped. Her heart pounded against her ribs as memories flooded back. The scratchy blankets of the orphanage, the whispered promises under the old oak tree, the tears as the Weber family car had driven away with the boy who had promised to come back for her. "Open Heart Orphanage, Orion Section," Thomas said softly. "You were the girl who taught me to carve wood when all the other boys made fun of me." "You promised you'd come back," Maya said, the words escaping involuntarily, her voice carrying 20 years of abandonment. "I tried," Thomas replied, something dark crossing his face, "for years, but my father, he had other plans." Xavier emerged from the work area, wiping his hands on a cloth, his eyes sizing Thomas up with accumulated suspicion. "So the young prince returns," he commented. 20 years later, Thomas held his gaze. "I understand your mistrust, but I came to ask for a chance to explain." "Xavier rescued me when I left the orphanage," Maya explained. "He taught me everything I know, gave me a home when no one else would. Something I promised to do," Thomas acknowledged with visible regret. "Why now?" "After all this time?" Maya challenged. Thomas took a deep breath. "In 3 weeks, I'll officially announce my engagement to a woman I don't love, take over the presidency of a company I secretly detest, and complete my transformation into the man my father always demanded I be." He paused significantly. Then I saw you, or rather, I saw the ring, and something stirred. Thomas's phone rang insistently on the screen. Elise, sixth call. She was nothing if not persistent in maintaining the facade of their relationship. She seems persistent, Maya observed bitterly. My jailer, he replied, silencing the call. Our marriage is a corporate merger disguised as romance. And what do you expect from me? Maya asked, crossing her arms. Absolution for abandoning me, for your family's part in pushing families like mine to the margins? Answers, he said simply, and maybe a chance to correct the biggest mistake of my life. What Thomas didn't reveal was the investigation he had begun the night before, a thorough search into Maya Olivera's past in the orphanage and the mysterious disappearance of documents related to the property that once belonged to her family. The coincidence of their meeting had prompted him to dig deeper into his father's business practices, suspecting that the Weber corporate legacy was built on foundations far less ethical than the public narrative suggested. What Maya concealed was the file hidden in the back of her workshop, yellowed papers with the Weber Enterprises logo, signed by Thomas's father, detailing the fraudulent acquisition of the Olivera family's land. The documents revealed how Ernesto Weber had exploited racist housing policies and banking regulations that made it nearly impossible for minority families to fight back against corporate predators, targeting her mother specifically because he knew a single black woman would have limited resources to challenge his legal manipulations. The truth that neither of them fully understood yet was how deeply their lives were intertwined, connected by more than childhood memories, and a sapphire ring that had somehow survived decades of separation. 3 days passed. Thomas canceled meetings and delegated responsibilities, immersing himself obsessively in old company files. Something didn't fit in his father's story about the land acquisition that was now part of the new Weber business complex. The more he investigated, the more disturbing patterns emerged. Systematic targeting of minority-owned properties, exploitation of legal loopholes that disproportionately affected communities of color, manipulation of property values through selective development that forced vulnerable homeowners to sell. At the family mansion, he searched his father's office when the house was empty, moving silently through the imposing space with its mahogany furnishings and oil paintings of Weber patriarchs. The weight of family legacy hung heavy in the air. Generations of power and privilege accumulated through what Thomas was beginning to understand were not always honorable means. In the bottom drawer of the antique desk, sealed with a lock that posed little challenge to someone who had spent childhood hours practicing with similar mechanisms, he found a folder labeled Project Aurora, the same name as the town where Maya lived. Inside were contracts, lawsuits, and one particularly disturbing document, a forged death certificate for Maya's mother, Maya Olivera. But there was more. Internal memos revealing how the company had specifically targeted minority-owned properties, knowing the owners would have limited legal resources to fight back. Notes in his father's handwriting referred to demographic advantages in acquisition strategy, a euphemism for exploiting systemic racism in property ownership. One memo specifically mentioned the particular vulnerability of the Olivera property due to its single, minority female ownership, and how this presented an optimal acquisition opportunity with minimal legal exposure. He faked her death to get the land, Thomas muttered in disbelief, and exploited her vulnerability because of who she was. At the same time, in Xavier's workshop, Maya was making her own decision. She had kept the truth for too long, watching as other families like hers were gradually pushed out by the expanding Weber empire, their protests silenced by a system that valued corporate interests over community well-being, particularly when those communities comprised people of color with limited political influence or financial resources. I'm going to confront him, she declared, revealing the hidden file to Xavier. The documents are authentic. His father's signature is on all of them, alongside notations about how to leverage demographic disadvantages to acquire the properties below market value. It's dangerous, Xavier warned, his eyes reflecting concern born of personal experience with the consequences of challenging power. The Webers destroyed your family once because of both greed and prejudice. They can do worse now. Maya caressed the sapphire ring, feeling its smooth surface beneath her fingertips, a connection to a mother she barely remembered and a past that had been stolen from her. I have nothing left to lose. That night, Thomas was driving toward the workshop when he received a message from Maya. Central Square, 20 minutes, come alone. The square in Aurora City was deserted when Thomas arrived, street lamps casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Maya waited on a bench under a leafy tree, strangely similar to the one at the orphanage where they had first met. The night air was heavy with the scent of impending rain, distant lightning occasionally illuminating the clouds gathering on the horizon. For 20 years, I wondered why my mother abandoned me. Maya began without preamble. Why I lost everything in an instant. Maya, I've discovered something terrible, Thomas interrupted, his eyes reflecting genuine horror. My father? Your father faked my mother's death, she finished, handing him some yellowed papers, then threatened her life if she tried to get me back. Also, he could take our land with the largest reserve of fresh water in the region, land he knew would skyrocket in value, but that he could acquire cheaply from a single black mother without resources to fight back. Thomas paled as he examined the documents, his fingers trembling as he turned the pages. The signature was unmistakable, identical to the one he had seen on his own discovery. His father's handwriting, familiar from childhood birthday cards and notes of congratulation on academic achievements, now revealed a darker purpose: the calculated destruction of a family for corporate gain. How did you get these? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. My mother left them with Xavier before she disappeared. He waited until I was old enough to understand the intersection of racial and economic injustice that made our family such an easy target. Maya pulled out an old photograph, the edges worn from years of handling. This is my mother, Maya Olivera. She didn't abandon me. She was forced to disappear. The photo showed a woman with a gentle face wearing the same sapphire ring. In the background stretched a green valley now transformed into concrete and steel bearing the Weber logo. Tomorrow I'm going to make everything public, Maya announced, at the groundbreaking ceremony for the new complex. Thomas stared at her, stunned. There will be hundreds of reporters, investors, politicians. Exactly, Maya confirmed. The perfect moment to reveal that the Weber empire was built on fraud, extortion, destroyed lives, and the systematic exploitation of minority families. Thomas's phone rang insistently, his father for the 5th time in a row. He ignored the call, the sound cutting through the quiet night like an accusation. There's more, Maya continued. I have reason to believe my mother is still alive. This revelation hit Thomas like a lightning bolt. How? Where? Her last communication came 8 years ago, an anonymous letter, but the handwriting was hers. Maya hesitated. From a psychiatric clinic in New Hope. Thomas took a deep breath, making a decision that would change everything. Don't wait until tomorrow, he said, his eyes meeting hers with new determination. Let's go now to the inauguration. My father moved the event up to tonight, fearing leaks about the project. What Thomas didn't say was that he had also discovered something even more disturbing: the exact location of Maya's mother. Not in a psychiatric clinic as Maya believed, but on a private Weber property, essentially held captive for 20 years as insurance against any challenges to the land acquisition. The realization of his father's true nature had shattered Thomas's remaining illusions about the family legacy he had been groomed to continue. In the limousine on the way to the complex, Thomas explained his plan. I have full access to the security system and the stage. I can put you in position at the exact moment to confront him publicly. Maya studied him with cautious eyes. Why are you helping me? This will destroy everything your family built. Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching the city lights blur past the window. Because some legacies don't deserve to continue, he finally said. And because 20 years ago, I made a promise to a girl who taught me that worth isn't determined by wealth or power or the color of your skin. The Weber corporate complex inauguration was a lavish affair. Crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light over the assembled guests in their designer clothing and perfectly maintained appearances. The business and political elite admired the imposing complex built on what had once been the Olivera family home, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries without a thought for whose land they stood upon or who had been displaced to create this monument to corporate success. Ernesto Weber, impeccable in his tailored suit that likely cost more than most families in Aurora City earned in months, smiled for the cameras. His authority was unquestionable. As he worked the room, shaking hands with influential figures and accepting congratulations on what the local newspaper had called a visionary expansion that would transform the region. "Thomas, finally!" he exclaimed when he saw his son. His eyes hardened when he noticed Maya beside him, her presence an anomaly in this carefully curated space. "What is she doing here?" "A special guest, father," Thomas replied coldly. "Someone with a fascinating story about the origins of this land and your predatory business practices targeting minority communities." Ernesto paled beneath his tan. "My office. Now." As they walked through the gleaming hallways of the new complex, Maya felt the weight of stares following them. Curiosity, dismissal, occasional outright hostility at her obvious intrusion into the sanctum of privilege. The expensive perfumes and colognes of the guests couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of fresh paint and new carpet, the artificial newness that had replaced the natural beauty of what had once been Olivera land. In Ernesto's luxurious office overlooking the devastated valley, the Weber patriarch stared at Maya with contempt. The room smelled of expensive cologne and leather, the trappings of power surrounding them, awards for corporate leadership displayed prominently, photographs of Ernesto with political figures and celebrities, all carefully arranged to project an image of success and influence. "How much?" he asked dryly. "What's your price for disappearing like your mother should have done?" "My mother," Maya replied, her voice steady despite the emotion swirling in her chest. "I want to know where she is." Ernesto laughed, a humorless sound that echoed off the glass and steel surfaces. "After all these years, she probably doesn't even remember you. The kind of care we provided for her kind was generous, considering." "She's alive then," Thomas concluded, discreetly recording the conversation on his cell phone. "You've kept her prisoner for 20 years. "Prisoner?" Ernesto dismissed the word with disdain. "I gave her a life of luxury in exchange for a piece of worthless land. It was a deal." "A deal made under threat is no deal," a new voice interjected. At the door stood Xavier, accompanied by an older woman whose eyes, identical to Maya's, overflowed with decades of contained pain. "Mother," Maya whispered, her voice breaking. Amelia Olivera advanced slowly, her eyes fixed on the daughter she hadn't seen since childhood. Her hands, once strong but now showing the frailty of age, trembled as she reached toward Maya. 2 decades of separation, compressed into a single moment of recognition, of connection that transcended the years of forced absence. "Maya," she said simply, her voice choked with emotion. Behind them in the hallway, Elise watched the scene with clinical interest, her cell phone recording every word exchanged. The society heiress had her own reasons for wanting to expose the truth about the Weber family, whose patriarch had manipulated her into an engagement with his son that served business interests rather than personal happiness. "Impossible," Ernesto muttered, taking a few steps back, his composure cracking. "You were under constant surveillance." "Your money buys silence, Ernesto. But not true loyalty," Amelia replied, her voice strengthened by decades of pent-up pain. "Some guards have families, they have hearts, they understand what it means to be separated from a child." Maya, trembling, slowly approached her mother. 20 years of forced abandonment, 20 years of unanswered questions. When they embraced, there were no words, only tears that spoke louder than any speech could have managed. Thomas watched the scene, a storm of emotions crossing his face. "Why, father?" he finally asked. "Why destroy a family for a piece of land? Why specifically target minority homeowners who couldn't fight back?" "That land was never just a piece of land," Ernesto replied, regaining some of his composure. "It's the largest reserve of drinking water in the region. It's worth billions, the future of this company. As for our acquisition strategy, business is business. Some demographics are simply more vulnerable to persuasion." "And that justifies destroying lives?" Thomas asked, his voice heavy with contempt. "How do you justify that to yourself?" A dangerous gleam crossed Ernesto's eyes. "The same way I justified adopting an orphan to replace the son I lost." The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas staggered as if he had been struck. "What?" he whispered, the color draining from his face. You think it's a coincidence that you spent 6 months in that orphanage? Ernesto laughed bitterly. Your mother died in childbirth along with our real son. You were just a convenient replacement, a baby with no problematic medical history, no family to interfere. You were an acquisition, Thomas, just like every other asset in the Weber portfolio. The revelation hit Thomas like an avalanche. His entire life, his entire identity, had been built on a lie. He wasn't a Weber by blood. He was an orphan whose records had been manipulated, just like Maya's family history had been falsified to facilitate Ernesto's corporate expansion. He's lying, said Elise, finally entering the room. In her hands was an old file. This explains why I always felt there was something wrong with our corporate merger disguised as marriage. What have you done? Ernesto asked, turning pale at the sight of the file. Proper research before a business marriage, she replied coldly, including his complete history of fraudulent adoptions. You didn't just adopt Thomas, there were others. Xavier approached Thomas, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. This means that you and Maya, you're not just childhood friends, Elise finished. You're half-siblings, same mother. Documents were forged to hide the connection and your true heritage. Maya and Thomas looked at each other. The truth reflected in their identical eyes. Same shade, same shape. How had no one noticed before? The connection they had felt as children at the orphanage hadn't been just friendship, but the invisible pull of blood relation, of family ties that had survived despite Ernesto's efforts to sever them permanently. That's why the ring meant so much to both of you, Amelia murmured. It was our family heirloom. I gave it to Thomas before Ernesto took him away, making him believe it was a gift from the mother he never knew. At that moment, police sirens sounded in the distance, rapidly approaching. Outside, the gathered elite of Aurora City's business community were beginning to notice the absence of their host and the commotion near his office. Rumors spread through the crowd, whispers of confrontation and unexpected revelations. This ends now, announced Thomas, his voice finding new determination. All the lies, all the manipulation, all the systematic exploitation of vulnerable families. Ernesto's face contorted with rage and disbelief. You would destroy everything I built? For what? Sentimentality? Some misguided sense of justice? For truth, Thomas replied simply, something your empire was never built on. The following week, newspapers exploded with headlines about the scandal. Ernesto Weber, respected magnate, arrested for fraud, kidnapping, document forgery, and civil rights violations related to predatory real estate practices targeting minority communities. The man who had built a reputation as a visionary business leader was revealed as a manipulator who had exploited systemic racism and economic inequality to build his fortune. The Weber empire, built on crime and the separation of families, collapsed as investigations revealed decades of corruption and racial discrimination in their business practices. Former employees came forward with stories of how they had been instructed to target demographically vulnerable neighborhoods, offering below-market prices for properties with the knowledge that the owners would have limited resources to obtain fair valuations or legal representation. The pattern of exploitation extended beyond the Olivera family to dozens of others, predominantly minorities, who had been systematically pushed out of their homes and communities to make way for Weber developments. What had been celebrated as urban renewal and economic development was exposed as a sophisticated form of displacement that disproportionately affected communities of color. Thomas, discovering his true identity as Amelia Olivera's son, renounced the Weber name and took his real surname. The psychological impact of learning his entire life had been built on deception was profound. But the discovery of his true heritage and the reconnection with his biological family provided a foundation for rebuilding his sense of self outside the shadow of the Weber legacy. The land illegally acquired from the Olivera family and others was legally returned. The corporate project transformed into an environmental reserve, with a community center benefiting hundreds of local families who had been displaced by Weber's predatory acquisitions. The freshwater reserve that had made the land so valuable was placed under a conservation trust, ensuring it would be managed for the benefit of the community rather than exploited for corporate profit. 6 months later, in the small Hope mechanical workshop, now expanded and modernized, Maya adjusted a car engine while Thomas reviewed documents for the newly created Olivera Foundation for abandoned children and families affected by predatory corporate practices. The workshop hummed with activity, several apprentices learning under Maya's guidance, including young people from communities that had been targeted by Weber Enterprises. "Is it still strange?" she asked, wiping grease from her hands. "To find out that your whole life was built on a lie, including the privilege that came with the Weber name." Thomas smiled, a genuine smile he had rarely shown in his previous life. "Strange, yes, but also liberating." He touched the small bird brooch he now wore as a pendant. "We lost 20 years, but we regained our truth, our family." The foundation they had established was already making waves, offering legal assistance to families fighting against corporate land grabs and predatory acquisition practices, particularly in minority communities. Where the Weber Empire had once exploited systemic racism for profit, the Olivera Foundation was working to dismantle those same systems. Maya Olivera had taken a central role in the foundation's work, her first-hand experience with corporate exploitation giving her unique insight into how to protect vulnerable communities. Her strength, resilience, and determination to prevent others from experiencing what her family had endured inspired those around her, including her children, who had found each other against seemingly impossible odds. The story of the Olivera family and the downfall of the Weber Empire became a catalyst for broader examination of corporate practices that disproportionately harmed minority communities. Regulatory changes were implemented at both local and state levels to prevent the kind of predatory acquisitions that had been Ernesto Weber's specialty, with particular attention to protections for property owners from historically marginalized groups. As Maya and Thomas worked side by side, rebuilding what had been broken and creating something new from the pieces of their shared past, the sapphire ring remained on Maya's finger. What had once been a symbol of loss and abandonment had transformed into a testament to truth's endurance and family bonds that couldn't be permanently severed, even by decades of separation and deliberate deception. Amelia entered the workshop carrying lemonade, the scent of citrus and sugar filling the air. Her eyes, once marked by sadness, now shone with the peace of someone who had finally found justice. "The ring," she said, noticing that Maya was still wearing it. "It always kept us connected, even when we didn't know it." The sapphire caught the afternoon light, sending blue reflections dancing across the workshop walls. A simple piece of jewelry had become the thread that connected past to present, that had guided a family back together across years of separation and deception. Sometimes the most elaborate lies are undone by the simplest of truths. A ring passed from mother to son, then to a sister who didn't even know she existed. And sometimes empires built on injustice and racial exploitation crumble not under the weight of guilt, but under the unshakable force of truth that resurfaces when least expected. The Olivera family's story became a powerful reminder that systems of oppression, no matter how entrenched they might seem, can be dismantled when people are brave enough to confront uncomfortable truths and determined enough to create meaningful change. The sapphire ring, now a symbol of that journey, continued to catch the light as Maya worked, a constant reminder that even the smallest objects can carry the weight of our most important connections. If this story about family ties buried under decades of lies and subtle racism touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that show how the truth, however painful, has the power to heal wounds that seemed permanent and reconnect lives that were separated by greed and prejudice. Have you ever discovered an object from your past that connected you to a truth you never knew? Share your experience in the comments below.